Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
One of the most powerful arguments for the inspiration of the Bible and even the deity of Jesus Christ is Messianic prophecy. And so often here on this program, we spend some time really equipping you to be more effective as you share your faith with others. And I would certainly say that this whole idea of prophecies written down in the Old Testament, literally fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, certainly are very powerful. There are, of course, lots of estimates on how many. Some people come up with a number of 333 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Others have numbers over 400. A lot of it depends on how you actually count those related prophecies, but they deal with nearly 60 different specific facts and details about a coming Messiah. These were all written down about 1400 BC to about 400 BC. And as we go through this hour, I wanted to spend some time really going into it in some detail. It is a very effective argument at any time of the year, but certainly at the Christmas season. And if you're finding yourself saying, well, I'd like some more information, I might mention that we have a booklet that we have prepared here at Point of View on Messianic prophecy that you could ask for. But I also might mention a couple of books that were instrumental to me in understanding this over the years. And one of those is by D. James Kennedy, called Messiah, Prophecies Fulfilled. And a second book, which I will also mention on other programs, is a book called Jesus by Tim LaHaye. And both of these have been very helpful to me, as well as many other books that I've found over the years on this whole particular issue, because when we look at those prophecies in the Old Testament written down, and then we see how they are fulfilled in the four Gospels, I think it's a very powerful kind of argument, and if nothing else, one that might really be helpful to you as you are witnessing to others. These are very powerful arguments, by the way, if you have an Orthodox Jewish friend, because after all, they believe in the Old Testament, and they will see that these are prophecies in the Torah or in the prophets or in the Psalms or other places that certainly they revere. So I would certainly hope that this would be helpful to you. And again, let me just mention some of the resources we can put in your hands. But as we go through this, first of all, I want to look at some of the prophecies related to the coming of Jesus, the prophecies of his coming, because we see in the Old Testament there were very specific prophecies that relate to him. And the first one, we don't have to go any further than the book of Genesis. In Genesis 3:15, we see an interesting statement here where it says ultimately that the Messiah would come from the seed of a woman, and that he would come to destroy the work of the devil. So in some respects here, we already see in Genesis 3:15 that God is for the first time really kind of revealing his master plan for salvation. And oftentimes theologians have even referred to this as, if you will, the pro-evangelist, the first evangel or the first gospel. And here it talks about this idea of a seed of a woman. I think it could be understood to suggest that the future descendant of Eve would have no human father. And, of course, we know how that fits into the idea of, indeed, the virgin birth. And so we also see that it goes on to say that you will bruise his heel. So it also says that Satan will inflict a painful wound on the woman's seed. But also then the idea is that Christ in turn will crush a mortal wound on the serpent, crushing his head. And so you can see that this, all sorts of things, begin to understand some of the things we see in the coming of Jesus Christ. The Messiah would not inherit a sin nature, which would, of course, disqualify him from then being able to be a substitutionary atonement, a person who dies in your place for your sin. And at the same time, it gives us the hope that there will be a time in which Christ will crush Satan. I think that ultimately finds its revelation and its culmination in the book of Revelation, in Revelation 20, verse 10. So right off the bat, even as we get into the book of Genesis, we already see one of those messianic prophecies. And then we see a whole series of prophecies that help us understand that the Messiah will come from a particular family tree. For example, you can go to Genesis 22 and Genesis, some other passages there that begin to talk about the fact that the Messiah would be a descendant of Abraham. Matter of fact, if you go all the way back to Genesis 11, it already says that he will come from the line of Shem. Well, you might say, who's Shem? Well, you had Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and actually in the ark, and so Shem would be the line that we follow. But then more specifically, we see that indeed the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham. Then if you go a little bit further, you see in Genesis 17 and Genesis 21 that the Messiah would be a descendant of Isaac. You have both Isaac and Ishmael. It's as if God is eliminating one half of the potential family line of the future. Then you go to Genesis 28. You also can go to Genesis 35, and you see that the Messiah would be a descendant of Jacob. And, of course, you have Jacob and Esau. So, again, it's as if God is eliminating one half of that family line in the future. Then it also goes on to tell us that the Messiah would be a descendant of Judah. We see that in Genesis 49. And if you think about that, of course, there were 11 other brothers of Jacob, so it eliminates 11/12 of those as well. By the time you get to Isaiah 11, you have something else, and it says that the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse in the tribe of Benjamin. So again, you can see how that eliminates so many other individuals. And then finally, we see, of course, in 2 Samuel 7, we see it again in Jeremiah 23, we even see it in Psalm 89, that the Messiah would be from the house of David. And so this is very significant, and I think also explains why Matthew takes the time to give us a genealogy to show us that indeed Jesus came from this family line, because this is, if you will, the family tree of the Messiah. Before we take a break, though, let me mention one other aspect of that, and that is since the genealogical records, the Jewish genealogical records were destroyed when the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D., then it would not be possible for the Messiah, if indeed the Messiah was born later, to even be able to prove his lineage back to David and thus fulfill this prophecy. So I think it is intriguing that even as we start in the book of Genesis and work our way through Genesis and a few other passages, we have to go to, of course, Isaiah 11 to get the tribe of Benjamin, and 2 Samuel 7 to get to the idea of the house of David. But I think we can see even in the first book of the Bible, we already begin to see some of these messianic prophecies which are pointing to a coming Messiah. And as we'll see as we work our way through this today, all literally fulfilled in one person, Jesus Christ. But let's take a break. We're going to continue looking at some of these messianic prophecies. Let me mention that if you would like a booklet that relates to this, we do have that available at Point of View. And of course, we hope that you would include a donation, because as we come to year end, it's so important for us to have your financial support helping us to end in the black. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover on Messianic prophecy, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The term anti-Semitism has been loosely thrown around for years and used recently to label the president, even though he has Jewish people in his extended family. It's about time to give specificity to a real problem that has often been redefined and demeaned by misuse. At the core of anti-Semitic thought is that Jews are the source of many social problems, and thus Jews are guilty of everything. This is what's so crazy about this false belief. Supposedly, Jews are the reasons for problems in commerce in our culture. Arab countries have 40 times the population of Israel and occupy land area that is 500 times greater. Yet it is Israel that is the problem and must be pushed into the sea. And the United Nations routinely passes resolutions condemning Israel while ignoring significant human rights abuses in other countries. The murderer who rushed into the Pittsburgh synagogue and killed 11 Jews certainly believed that Jews were the problem and needed to be killed. If you read some of his Gab posts, you will be horrified by his anti-Semitic words and images. Dennis Prager reminds us that Jews understand this hatred. On Passover, they read from a Jewish prayer book these words, "In every generation they arise to annihilate us." Notice it doesn't say persecute us or even enslave us. Anti-Semites want to kill all Jews and eliminate them from the planet. This level of hatred isn't just irrational, it's demonic. It's about the only explanation you can have for people possessed by a level of hatred that makes no sense. Jews number 18 million in a world population of 7.5 billion. Israel occupies a landmass no bigger than New Jersey, yet Jews are the problem and Israel is the problem. This only makes sense when viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about Messianic prophecy. Again, these were Old Testament prophecies written down in the Old Testament from about 1400 BC to about 400 BC, literally fulfilled in one person, Jesus Christ. We do know that there were other people claiming to be the Messiah before and even after the time of Jesus, and yet, of course, only one of those individuals appealed to the fulfillment of those prophecies, and that is Jesus. Matthew, of course, spends a fair amount of time, as well as Luke, talking about how these various elements were fulfilled. And so we've looked at a little bit of the idea of the family tree of Messiah. Let's look at some others related to his coming. And that is, again, very interesting, as many people know, certainly during the Christmas season, that in Micah 5:2, it predicts that the Messiah will be born in the little city of Bethlehem. Now, this is a very little city indeed. This was revealed to Micah in the 8th century BC. So we really are talking about something that happens hundreds and hundreds of years before the time of Christ. And it certainly is not what you would necessarily pick as the place where you would have the birth of a coming king. You'd expect that to be Jerusalem or at least some other town of note. Bethlehem is so insignificant that at one point when they're listing the various towns and cities in the Old Testament, it isn't even in the list. As a matter of fact, Micah makes a very specific comment about Bethlehem to make sure you don't confuse it with something else. And, of course, the birth of Christ in Bethlehem was not the choice of Mary and Joseph. It was something really forced upon them by Caesar Augustus, and his decree for taxation required Joseph to return to his home, if you will, the home city of Bethlehem from his city of Nazareth, and so as a result had to do that in order to pay the tax. So if nothing else, you have Matthew referring to this. You have Luke in chapter 2, of course, referring to this in the birth of Jesus according to Micah 5:2. Then we have the other very interesting statement, which we see in the book of Isaiah, and that is that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. We see that Isaiah 7, verse 14. And again, this is very important. Luke, once again, talks about that fulfillment in Luke chapter 1. And some people have even pointed out how significant this is, because in the modern world, a lot of people have said, is it really that important that we believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? And many of the individuals I mentioned just a minute ago, people like Tim LaHaye and others, have pointed out that there are some consequences if that's not true. Because number one, it would mean that the New Testament is not true. Number two, it might mean that Mary was guilty of unchastity. Number three, it means that the prophecy of Isaiah was incorrect. Number 4, it might mean, of course, obviously, that Jesus was not born of the Holy Spirit. And number 5, that there's really no miracle at Christmas. So there are some really significant situations that oftentimes develop when we say, well, that particular doctrine or that particular belief is not important. Of course it is. Then we have in the book of Jeremiah, of all things, Jeremiah 31 talks about Rachel weeping. Now, you might remember Rachel was the wife of Jacob and kind of was seen as, if you will, the symbolic figure of Israel. And many people, I think, at the time probably understood that to mean simply that this was the sorrow that Israel had as their children were taken into captivity into Babylon. Well, the book of Matthew, though, proclaims that Jeremiah's prophecy actually was fulfilled when Herod ordered all the children under the age of 2 being killed. So here you have a prophecy which at the time might have not even been understood to be a messianic prophecy, but Matthew helps us understand that indeed it was. And that relates to another one which is kind of intriguing as well, because in the book of Hosea, in chapter 11, it talks about, again, the Messiah being called out of Egypt. Now, you could see at the time how some might have believed that this would be, well, of course, after all, the children of Israel were called out of Egypt. And so certainly that could be the way it might have been interpreted at the time. But instead, Matthew, in chapter 2, records that Joseph and Mary took the young child, that is Jesus, into Egypt, and says in verse 15 that they remained there until the death of Herod, and then they returned back to the land of Israel. So you can see that even there, another one of those statements in the Old Testament, whether it is this idea of Rachel weeping in Jeremiah, or whether it is the idea of being called out of Egypt in Hosea, are again messianic prophecies in the Old Testament that were literally fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Well, those are a number of prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. For a few minutes, and even into the next segment, I want to spend some time now talking about prophecies of his ministry. What were those prophecies related to what the Messiah would do? And we start seeing all sorts of prophecies that fit in that particular area, because first of all, we see in a number of passages in the Old Testament that there would be a forerunner to the Messiah, somebody who would be preparing the way. You can see this in Isaiah chapter 40. You see it also in Malachi 3 and 4, where they said there would be some kind of forerunner to the Messiah. And of course, we obviously can see how those prophecies were fulfilled by John the Baptist. And you see this in Matthew 11. You see this in Luke 3. And if nothing else, you can see again its significance, because there was a time in which, because of the disobedience of Israel, God removed the prophetic voice, and so there was a silence, if you will. There were no prophets during this very long period of time, centuries long, in which there was no prophetic voice until you have this special witness of John the Baptist. And so whether you look in the Old Testament in Numbers 6 or Luke chapter 1, you can see how that one, again, is fulfilled in the person of John the Baptist. Then we have this interesting idea that you see in Deuteronomy 18, and that is this idea that the Messiah would be a prophet like Moses, that God would raise up a prophet like me from your brethren. And so this one I have found to be very helpful as well if you are witnessing to maybe some of your Orthodox Jewish friends. There's a couple of chapters, as a matter of fact, in some of the books I just recommended. This book called Messiah, Prophecies Fulfilled by D. James Kennedy. There's a whole section in chapter 17 in which there are some interesting parallels between Moses and Jesus. But I thought for just a minute I might read some of those from Tim LaHaye's book, because he has 12 different parallels between the two in chapter 5 of his book, in which he points out things that both men spent their infant years in Egypt. We just talked about that. Both men grew up to be tremendous leaders, teachers, and prophets. Both men fasted for 40 days. Both men delivered the law from a mountain. Moses from Mount Sinai, Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Both men performed remarkable miracles before eyewitnesses. Both men had power over demonic forces. Both men had power to control bodies of water. Moses parts the Red Sea. Jesus calms the Sea of Galilee. Both men's face shone with the glory of God. Moses on the Mount Sinai, Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. One of the others, as Moses was lifted up the brazen serpent to heal his people, Jesus was lifted up on a cross to heal believers from sin. Interestingly enough, on the 17th day of the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar, that's when Moses offered salvation to the children of Israel by leading them through the Red Sea. 1,500 years later, on that same day, Jesus offered salvation to the world by rising from the dead. Both men died on a hill. Neither of their bodies remained in a tomb. And, of course, you can read the details because I've really gone through that very quickly. But I think it's striking to see the remarkable parallels. Tim LaHaye mentions 12 different parallels. Jim Kennedy mentions 10 different parallels. And I've also found that to be a very effective kind of witnessing tool as well, because oftentimes we run into individuals that find themselves saying, well, I believe in the Torah. Well, that's part of Deuteronomy, and right there you can begin to develop that in a way that would be a great evangelistic opportunity. Well, we need to take a break, and let me just mention, as we're coming to a break right now, we certainly do want you to think about what you might do as we come to year-end to support this ministry. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and click on the donate button, and again, your special gift would be very helpful to us at year-end. But I would also encourage you, if you'd like, to also give us a call, 800-347-5151, if you'd like to make a pledge. Or, of course, you can send your gift to us at Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. We're dependent upon your gifts to bring these kinds of programs to you. And if you learned a little bit today about Messianic prophecy, that's reason enough to certainly would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. And if you can, send us a gift. Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continuing our discussion today on Messianic prophecy, and I thought I might just mention that as we go through this, some of the material is available on our website, but again, we have a little booklet that you might want to obtain, and for your gift, especially year-end gift, we would certainly want to send that to you if you have any interest. But let's continue on, because there are all sorts of prophecies written down in the Old Testament from about 1400 BC to about 400 BC, 56 specific facts, details about the coming Messiah, literally fulfilled in the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the ones I want to focus on now for just a few minutes are the timetable, because there's at least two categories of prophecies relating to when to be even looking for the Messiah. The first is pretty simple. That is, it is very clear if you look at the Old Testament that the Messiah will come when the temple of Jerusalem is standing. Now, when some of those prophecies were issued, there was a temple. When some of those prophecies were issued, there were not. And so that's striking alone. For example, in Malachi 3, in Psalm 118, or Daniel 9, which we'll come back to in just a minute, or Zechariah 11, or Haggai 2, we have this idea that the temple is there when the Messiah is there. That makes sense, but recognize there were times when the temple did not exist, was either destroyed, and more importantly, for those saying, well, the Messiah might come today, I'm saying, well, no, the temple was destroyed in AD 70, and that is significant as well. So one of those very important categories of prophecies all have to do with the fact that the Messiah would actually come when there is a temple, and we can see that really fulfilled in Matthew chapter 21. But a more specific prophecy that many prophecy experts like to spend some time on can be found in Daniel 9, verse 25. And this, interestingly enough, has to do with the fact that Daniel is asking, when will the Messiah come? And so this is the prophecy of what many times people call the 70 weeks. Now, weeks are like sevens of years, so it'd be the 70 sevens of years, or in particular, it says that there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then to be looking for the Messiah. Now, each week represents, day of the week represents 1 year. So when we talk about that, 70 weeks would be 490 years. And so we're looking for 69 weeks or 69 sevens of years. That turns out to be 485 years. Or if you look at the Jewish calendar, it turns out to be 173,880 days. Now, you don't have to get into the details of that. But the question is, when do you start counting? And then what happened when you stopped counting? Well, when you start counting is pretty clear in the prophecy, because it says that when there is a decree to go out and to rebuild, everybody, I think, pretty much accepts that that is a decree by Artaxerxes. And that's actually recorded in Nehemiah chapter 2. And we know from history when that happens. So that's 445 BC. So 445 BC, now you start your stopwatch, if you will, and you now start counting out 173,880 days, and that would tell us that the Messiah would appear when? Well, the actual day would be what we today call Palm Sunday, the day in which Jesus rides into Jerusalem and is proclaimed as the Messiah. There's a lot more detail to it, but it is really one of the more powerful prophecies, because we know when the prophecy was issued. We know when it is supposed to start, the decree of Artaxerxes. We know how many days there are, and we also know what was happening on that day. And I think it's really one of the more powerful arguments for, of course, the fulfillment of Messianic prophecy in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, what was Jesus doing on that day? Well, again, we see a prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9 that the Messiah will enter Jerusalem riding a donkey. Now, Zechariah envisioned the Messiah riding on the foal of an ass. And so, again, this is this idea of something very different than what people would have expected. They would have expected the Messiah to be like a king, like a conqueror, coming in a chariot. And if nothing else, we see in that particular phraseology that we see in Zechariah 9 that indeed it shows the humility of the Messiah. And of course, we see the fulfillment of that in Matthew 21 as well as in Luke 19. Let's, if we can, then go a little bit further, because we can now see some of these other things that are beginning to unfold. And one of those is the idea that the Messiah would be betrayed by a friend. And we see that in Matthew chapter 41. Of course, the fulfillment of that is very easy to find, of course, in the Gospels, but we'll use Matthew 26 and 27 as a great illustration of that, how Judas, of course, was a friend, a disciple who betrays Jesus. And then we come to a very specific prophecy, which we find in Zechariah 11, because the price of this betrayal is supposed to be something that many people would not necessarily have expected, and that is that the betrayal would be for 30 pieces of silver. It would be cast on the floor of the temple, and number 3, it would be used to buy a potter's field. Now, those are very, very specific prophecies. First of all, 30 pieces of silver. The estimate is that at the time in which that prophecy was actually given, the currency was in gold, not silver, but it's specifically 30 pieces, not 29, not 31, but 30 pieces of silver. Second of all, cast on the floor as of the temple, and then used to buy a potter's field. You can see that Matthew, in Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10, spends a fair amount of time explaining how indeed that was fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. Let's look at a few more real quickly. We see that when we look at the trial of Jesus, a whole series of prophecies are fulfilled, and in each particular case, Matthew in 26 and 27 show how those were all fulfilled. Let's look at 3 of those. The first is that the Messiah will be accused by false witnesses. You see that in Psalm 35, verse 11. Of course, that's fulfilled. We see that in Matthew 26. We see it in Mark 14. We also see during the trial of Jesus that the Messiah will not open his mouth to defend himself. That, of course, is in a famous passage in Isaiah 53, which oftentimes we read at the Christmas time. And again, we see that that is fulfilled in Matthew 27, verse 12. And then we see in Isaiah 50, verse 6, that he will be beaten and spit upon. And again, we see that fulfilled in Matthew 26 and Matthew 27. So all of those being fulfilled right there in the whole trial itself. I might just mention, while we're talking about some of these out of the Psalms, you also have a Psalm 69, that says that he will be hated for no reason. And if you think about that, that certainly fits into Jesus. You have some other passages that talk about the Messiah performing miracles, and we see that being fulfilled as well. So even though I'm skipping over many of these other very significant prophecies, I think you can begin to see that these begin to add up. And if you think about the probabilities that these prophecies could even be fulfilled by chance, it just simply doesn't work very well. So before we take a break, let me take one more, and that is, we'll move from the trial to the crucifixion. And we see also in Isaiah 53, again, a passage we tend to read at Christmas time, that the Messiah will be numbered with transgressors. And, of course, we see that being fulfilled because Jesus was crucified as a criminal in between two particular thieves. It also, interestingly enough, tells us that he will be pierced. We see that in Psalm 22. We also see that in Zechariah 12. And it's interesting that especially when you look at Psalm 22, this was written at least 1,000 years before the time of the death of Jesus. And think about, what was the penalty for, say, blasphemy back then? Well, it was stoning. But the Sanhedrin had no longer any legal right to put people to death. So crucifixion was implemented by the Roman Empire. But again, it's important to understand that the Roman Empire adopted this idea from the barbarians and only was implemented in Rome a century earlier, and it was only to be used against those who were not Roman citizens and for the most heinous of crimes. But of course, we see Pontius Pilate had Jesus Christ crucified according to Roman law. So we see, first of all, Jesus was crucified with criminals, and also he was pierced through. But in just a minute, we want to talk about his burial, because that also turns out to be another fulfillment of prophecy. But we need to take a break, and let me just mention as we do so, we do encourage you to consider what you might want to do to help us before year end. So if you visit our website, pointofview.net, we would greatly appreciate that. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some more of this, we do have a booklet that is available. Let's take a break. We'll continue on with these Messianic prophecies right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Sophia McLeod was hired to work in customer service for XPO Last Mile, a logistics company out of Maryland, but he didn't even make it to his first day of work. When McLeod's operations manager called him to let him know he was hired and asked him to report to work on October 3rd, 2016, McLeod explained there was a problem. McLeod wanted to report to work that day, but it was Rosh Hashanah, one of the holiest days of the year for him as an Orthodox Jew. He asked if reporting the next day would be permissible. Initially, the manager agreed, but later that evening, the market vice president called to inform McLeod that the only days the company observed were federal holidays, not religious ones. McLeod chose to observe his holy day and showed up for work on October the 4th. When he did, he was sent home, and now the EEOC is involved, suing XPO for religious discrimination. EEOC Regional Attorney Deborah Lawrence said it well, quote, "The freedom to exercise one's religious beliefs is one of our nation's fundamental values. A one-day postponement of a start date is not an undue hardship," unquote. In other words, religious liberty and the corporate mission need not be in conflict. Accommodating the religious practices of our employees is good business. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about Messianic prophecy. We've gone through quite a number, but let me finish off by, first of all, coming back to what we just talked about a minute ago. At the crucifixion, of course, we have Jesus being crucified as a criminal between two thieves. And we see in Isaiah 53 the fact that he would be numbered with the transgressors. So that is certainly very significant. Also, of course, mentioned just a minute ago that the Messiah would be pierced. You see that in Psalm 22. You see it in Zechariah 12. And again, to recognize that especially Psalm 22 was written probably 1,000 years before the death of Christ. And at that time, the penalty for blasphemy was stoning. There wasn't anything that would talk about piercing. But, of course, the Sanhedrin no longer had the right to put people to death, so Jesus was crucified according to Roman law. But even there, the idea of crucifixion only was implemented in the Roman Empire about 100 years before. Then, as he is even being crucified, we have some other things that are being said as well. Psalm 34:20, for example, says that the Messiah's bones would not be broken. Some people have made a point about the fact that if you go back to Exodus 12, it said that the Passover lamb's bones were not to be broken. And so maybe there's an allusion there. But nevertheless, we see that being fulfilled in John 19, verse 33, something about the bones not being broken. And that's because Jesus had already died. You see in Psalm 22, which I just mentioned a minute ago, that they will divide his clothing and cast lots for them. And John in 19, verses 23 to 24, talks about that as well. Also, we see in Psalm 69, verse 21, that he will be given vinegar and gall to drink. And Matthew 27 says that is a fulfillment of Messianic prophecy. And then perhaps the most significant is that as you read Psalm 22, and you may want to turn there or look at it during your quiet time or something of that nature, what's the first words in Psalm 22? They're these words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Where have we heard that before? From the cross. In a sense, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, that particular psalm relates to me. And of course, we see that fulfilled in Matthew 27. So we see that Jesus was crucified with criminals, but it also, interestingly enough, in Isaiah 53 says that he would be buried with the rich, his grave with the wicked, but the rich at his death. And we see, as Matthew 27 points out here, that again, the body of Jesus was placed in the tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. And so we can see how that begins to fit with that as well. So finally, we've looked at a number of these prophecies of his coming and prophecies of his ministry. One more I'd like to look at for just a minute, and that is what you might call the prophecies of his victory. And of course, we already saw this idea of, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? We see the bones were not broken. We see they divided his clothing, cast lots for it, given vinegar and gall and the rest. So we see so much of that. But let's go back to Psalm 22, which I've already given you some of that, and recognize that it goes into even more detail while Jesus is on the cross and while he is achieving victory for us by dying for our sins. Because you have not only this idea of dividing his clothes, but you also have in verse 8 of Psalm 22, the mockery of Jesus, or the mockery of the Messiah, who is, of course, fulfilled by Jesus. Then the idea of shame, which we see in verse 13. Then the idea of pain, verses 14 to 16. And, of course, then culminating with the parting of his garments. And so all of this, of course, is very poignant as you read Psalm 22, but fortunately Psalm 22 doesn't end with crucifixion. It sort of hints at resurrection because of this idea of suffering that leads to salvation. And so even as we read one of these really kind of dark Psalms, Psalm 22, it's already sort of hinting at the victory, which we also see in Isaiah 53. But more importantly, what we see in some other passages is this. In Psalm 16, verse 10, it confirms that God would not leave the Holy One in hell, nor would his body see corruption. And it's interesting because when Peter stands before those Jewish people on the day of Pentecost, he refers back in his famous sermon, if you will, in Acts 2, verses 25 to 32, to the resurrection, in which he quotes from Psalm 16, his soul was not left in hell, neither did his flesh see corruption. And so you already see that idea as well. And, of course, this is fulfilled, of course, in Acts 2, verse 31. So as we go through this, you can see that, as I mentioned at the outset here, over 300 different Messianic psalms. Some people count 333, others count more than 400. Really just depends on whether you count some of the related psalms and prophecies together, some of the prophecies in Isaiah and Genesis and other passages as individual or collective. But the point is that we have at least 56 different specific facts or details about the coming Messiah that were literally fulfilled in the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, lots of people have done calculations, and perhaps you've heard these before, of what would be the probability that any one individual could fulfill some of these prophecies. And, of course, a very famous book that came out years ago by Professor Peter Stoner called Science Speaks estimated that just the prophecy of one per person fulfilling just 8 of those messianic prophecies, things like 30 pieces of silver, not gold, cast on the floor of the temple, betrayed by a friend. He figured that the prophecy of just 8 of those prophecies being fulfilled by chance would be one chance in 10 to the 17th power. That'd be 1 with 17 zeros. Or the chance of fulfilling 48 of those prophecies would be one chance in 10 to the 157th power. Those odds are astronomical and illustrate again that what we have with Messianic prophecy is, I think, a very powerful argument. Whether it's the Christmas season or you're just simply talking to your friends, I hope that you will see that this hour we've spent some time really giving you some confidence about the fact that Messianic prophecy really does point to the inspiration of the Bible and the deity of Jesus Christ. So as we wind down this hour, let me just encourage you to visit our website, which is www.pointofview.net. Click on the donate button so that you can make a special gift for our year end. We, of course, are dependent upon your financial gifts to keep this program on the air. And, of course, your support will obviously help us end the year in the black. Now, as you make your gift, feel free, if you would, to ask for a copy of this booklet on Messianic prophecy, because it does provide kind of a brief overview of some of the things we've talked about this hour. And I might mention that we oftentimes even send these books to individuals that are donors. If you give at least $50 a month towards Point of View, you actually qualify at that level to receive these books in the mail every single month. So you might even think about, as you make your donation, think about maybe making a pledge for this coming year. It'd be a great opportunity for you to receive those on a regular basis. But again, as we end this hour, let me just encourage you to visit the website. It is www.pointofview.net. Or you could also give us a call. That number is 800-347-5151. If somebody answers, you can certainly give your pledge. If not, you can leave your information on voicemail. We'll be glad to call you back. And, of course, if you'd like to send in your gift, it's very simple. Just simply write a check out, make it to Point of View, and then send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Dallas, Texas 75221. I want to thank you for listening today to Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time really focusing on the person of Jesus Christ. Now, of course, that's kind of the foundation of our faith. But I want to do this in a way that not only is an encouragement to you, but maybe passes on some ideas about how to use this in evangelism, in witnessing, and other kinds of things. I'm going to be taking a fair amount from a book that came out a number of years ago called Jesus, Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him, written by Tim LaHaye. And the reason I want to use that is that not only was that just a very interesting book, it's almost a coffee table kind of book, but it spends a little bit of time, as we will hear maybe in the first segment, talking about why Jesus. That's a very important question that didn't used to exist so long ago. If you were a Christian, say 100 years ago, and you're sharing your faith and you're talking about the Bible, you're talking about Jesus, people will be going, okay, well, and they'd either agree or disagree. What I began to run into when I was speaking on college campuses, and I run into now more and more just everywhere, is the reaction from especially those who are not believers as to, well, why? Why should I care? I mean, why should I be interested in Jesus rather than, say, Buddha? Why should I be interested in the Bible compared to, say, the Bhagavad Gita? For that matter, why should I be interested in any religion? Because one of the fastest growing demographics today are what are called the nones, people that say they don't believe in God. So they claim either atheist, agnostic, or no preference. So it does seem to me that one of the things that Tim LaHaye does early on in the book, which is really kind of the subtitle of the book, Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him, is to ask a very important question. Why Jesus? I mean, if you deal with some of the material that he has there, it's interesting because if you think about it, truth is stranger than fiction. If you look at this from a secular point of view, have an individual who was a young carpenter from a relatively obscure village who then goes on to be the most influential person in all of history. And for the next couple of minutes, I want to give you some kind of talking points on that, because even after he is killed, he has had a profound impact on the world. Now, I'll use the numbers that Tim LaHaye has in the book, but you can come up with numbers that are comparable. And that is, he says, it's estimated anywhere from 70 to 100 million people believe in such a story right here in the United States. There are about 2 billion people worldwide who call themselves Christians. That doesn't mean they're all born again, hardly. But they still believe in the story, and a good number of them have staked their eternal destiny on that. So that's kind of interesting in its first step. Then when this book came out years ago, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins were on because they'd had some best-selling books on with Larry King, and even Larry King said things like, I'm not a believer, but I do have the utmost respect for Jesus Christ. I believe he was the most influential person who ever lived. And if you think about this and then start looking through history, it's probably fair to say that about 13 billion people that have lived on this earth at one point or another have existed, and maybe even more than that, but we'll use that number for just a minute. And you have to ask yourself, why is it that this one person, Jesus, has drawn so much attention? And you can begin to describe that in so many different ways. Inspiration for literature. Think of all the books written about Jesus, but also the others that have Christian themes. Music. Think of all the music that either had Christian themes or was influenced in one way or another by Western culture, which was, of course, influenced by Christianity, and the art world and those kinds of things. You have millions of churches around the world. You have a calendar which was set to what at the time was thought when his birth was. The two biggest holidays that you still see worldwide are Christmas and Easter. And so in some respects, you have to say that he has had such an incredible influence in terms of our history. What about his influence in philosophy? I love this because, again, Tim LaHaye documents that you can look at other philosophers from Confucius and Descartes and Hume and Kant and Rousseau and whoever it might be. Still, Jesus has such a profound influence. Just take the Greek philosophers. Really, when you talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, their careers total about 150 years. And yet, Jesus Christ, in many ways, is more influential than they are after having a public ministry of a mere 3.5 years. When you look at print, you see the same sort of thing. Even critics have to admit his influence. H.G. Wells, of course, is known as the author, for example, of The Outline of History, and was an outspoken socialist and a promoter of Darwinism. Yet when he wrote his Outline of History, he devoted a staggering 41 pages in his historical treatment to Jesus Christ. Plato, by the way, gets a 2-page mention. For those of you that are old enough, remember your Encyclopedia Britannicas. Again, they document that when we used to have those Encyclopedia Britannicas, 21,000 words in the Encyclopedia Britannica about Jesus Christ, the largest biographical entry of all. And then you can take some other individuals, literary figures. Mark Twain in Innocents Abroad said, "In the starlight, Galilee had no boundaries but the broad compass of the heavens, and as a theater met for great events, meet for the birth of a religion able to save the world." Then you think about even in the news magazines. You go right now, I've noticed one news magazine's got a picture of Jesus on it, and if you take Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News Report, as well as other magazines. You know, the picture of Jesus shows up so many times in many of those news magazines, articles about Jesus in the newspaper, and those all, I think, illustrate, again, the profound influence. And even those that challenge the claims of Jesus Christ or challenge the Bible, whether it's the Da Vinci Code or misquoting Jesus by Bernard Bart Ehrman or people like that, you certainly see that. How about the movies? You know, the Da Vinci Code I mentioned a minute ago, The Passion of the Christ. So many significant ways in which our culture really has, in many ways, illustrated the fact that if you really want to be an educated person, you need to know something about Jesus. And I think that becomes a really good entree into a society today that says, you know, I can live my life without looking at the Bible. I can live my life without even checking out who Jesus is. I think you could point out to any fair-minded individual, they really do need to figure out who Jesus is and really need to make their peace with that as well. So what I want to do is when we come back from the break, really ask a fundamental question that Jesus asked, and that is, who do you say that I am? You might remember that here he takes his disciples to what's called Caesarea Philippi, and he asks them, of course, two questions. And they're in the presence of all these pagan witnesses and things like this. And so, first of all, he said, who do men say that I am? Of course, you get all sorts of different answers and everything. And finally, he says, who do you say that I am? And so that's the question we want to put on the table here. When we come back from the break, begin to look at some of the evidence that we have for the claims that Jesus makes, for the fulfilled prophecy in his life, for the miracles he performed, for his parallel to many other things in the Old Testament, and then, of course, end with the idea of the resurrection. So some of this will be familiar territory. Some of it will hopefully be new. I will always try to have enough basic information that if it's the first time you've understood it, you'll understand it, but also have enough in there that even if you're a seminary professor, maybe you'll say, I learned something new. Let's take a break. We'll come back and begin to look at the evidence for the deity of Jesus Christ.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again while we talk about the deity of Jesus Christ and how to use this in a witnessing context. I certainly do encourage you to find some of the material we have on our website. And let me also mention again that a lot of what I'm taking comes from today, the book called Jesus, Why the World is Still Fascinated by Him by Tim LaHaye. And one of the chapters we want to look at is All the Signs Point His Way. And part of that has to do with the issue of prophecy. I have talked about prophecy and Messianic prophecy in more detail, so I thought I will summarize this. But before we even get into that, let's just think about the nature of prophecy. Because in the Old Testament, you were supposed to be 100% accurate. Biblical prophets were that way. Tim LaHaye talks about the fact that we have Madame Helena Blavatsky, who was an individual who was very influential in the 19th century as an occultist. And in some respects, the organization she worked with kind of founded some of the ideas which we today call the New Age movement and used this idea of clairvoyance and channeling. But was she 100% accurate? Obviously not. I think you would know a lot more about her if we did have any kind of accurate predictions being made by her. Edgar Cayce is another one that he mentions here, the so-called sleeping prophet, who was an American psychic and taught while in a hypnotic trance on all sorts of subjects like reincarnation and astrology and things of that nature. And then, of course, you have probably one of the individuals that I hear mentioned every once in a while is Nostradamus, born in the 16th century, late part of the 16th century, 1503, and actually gained some fame for his book about prophecies. But they were so kind of bizarre that it's really hard to even read into any of them, whether they accurately predicted what was taking place in the future. And the few times people have held out that one of these prophecies of Nostradamus is a good example that he was a prophet, you can point to all the others that make no sense at all. And I won't go into all the details, but simply to come back and recognize that one of the best arguments I can make for somebody as to why they should pay attention to Jesus is that you have prophecies written down in the Old Testament that were literally fulfilled in his life. And one of the best arguments you can make for why a person should read the Bible is the fact that indeed 1/4 of the Bible, actually I think people have calculated about 27% of the Bible, when written, was prophetic in nature. That means that we have more than 1,000 plus prophecies that have now been already fulfilled. Some of those have to do with Messianic prophecies. Others have to do with Tyre and a variety of other cities and things of that nature in Babylon. But nevertheless, we can see that because these prophecies have been fulfilled, I think we'd have confidence that future prophecies will be fulfilled as well. One of the books that I have on my shelf, and I also have a digital copy on my laptop computer, is a book that was put together by J. Barton Payne. It's entitled The Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy, and there it actually lists the 1,239 prophecies in the Old Testament and the 578 prophecies in the New Testament for a total of 1,817 prophecies that encompass about 8,300 different verses. And so if you want to look more at the issue of prophecy, there are certainly some excellent books that have come out to actually deal with that. And I might mention that this idea of fulfilled prophecy really validates the Bible itself, because if these were accurate, and these are accurate according to what we can test in terms of history and archaeology, then other things which we really can't test, things like the attributes of God, the existence of heaven or hell, maybe we can believe those as well. Just this last week, I was talking to an individual that was asking about that. What does this idea of fulfilled prophecy actually do to help us? And I said, well, it helps us show that indeed the things that we can test and we can verify, as well as the historicity and accuracy of the Gospels, the book of Acts and things like that, show that it is a historical document, because we really don't have any way scientifically or historically or even archaeologically to verify some of the other things that I just mentioned, like the attributes of God. So we can trust that based on the fact that what we can test is verifiable. And so again, it's just one more argument to suggest that a fair-minded individual would certainly want to spend some time looking at the Bible and investigating Jesus Christ. Since I have talked about Messianic prophecy, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but again, it's a good review, especially if you haven't had a chance to hear that, because what we can see is that these prophecies in the Old Testament were understood at the time to actually be important. For example, you have the story of Simeon, who's anticipating the arrival of the Messiah, because he knew that there would be a Messiah coming, and then he was granted the opportunity to see the babe, of course, and that is where we read in Luke 2:30, "My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared." And then, of course, we have a lot of prophecies starting in the book of Genesis. We have Genesis 3:14 and 15 talks about the Messiah being born of the seed of a woman. And then later you even have in Isaiah 7:14 the idea of the virgin birth. And, of course, that's fulfilled, we see in Matthew chapter 1. We have the prophecies that give us the genealogical lineage of who indeed Jesus is, that he would come from Shem, because there was Ham, Shem, and Japheth, so it sort of eliminates 2/3 of the population at that time. Then Abraham, that narrows it down even more so. Jacob, well, you have Jacob and Esau, so that cuts it again. Judah is just one of the tribes. 11 of the 12 are eliminated, if you will, all the way to David in Isaiah 9. And you see why it, I think, was so important for both Matthew in Matthew 1 and Luke in Luke 3 to put those genealogies in there to show that Jesus indeed did come from the line that the Messiah would come from. Of course, we've also talked about the fact that when you go to Micah 5:2, it talks about the fact that the Messiah would be born in this small town of Bethlehem. That, of course, is fulfilled in Matthew 2 and Luke 2. And then you also have the statement in Hosea 11 that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. And in Matthew 2, we have the story that Matthew tells us of Joseph and Mary and Jesus actually fleeing to Egypt and eventually then coming back to their home in Nazareth. And then, of course, you have this idea that before the Messiah comes, there would be a forerunner. We see this in both the books of Isaiah and Malachi, and that's fulfilled in Luke chapter 3. And then we have a very specific prophecy about when indeed the Messiah would come, that there would be 69 weeks of years or 69 sevens of years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And that decree comes in 444 BC and is actually fulfilled in AD 33, which again is just a very clear indication that Jesus is that Messiah. And then the prophecies dealing with his crucifixion, his execution, if you will. We have in Zechariah that he would be pierced. We have in Psalm 22 the very powerful phrase, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" In Psalm 22 also that they would divide his garments. And in Psalm 34 that there would be no broken bones. And so all of that fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus. And then in his burial, you have this statement in Isaiah 53, verse 9, that his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Certainly he is crucified with the wicked, and he's placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We read about that in Matthew 27. So you have just an incredible number of prophecies. Some estimate 333 prophecies. Some come up with a number over 400. Depends on which ones you link together as related prophecies. But as I've shared on this program before, even trying to come up with a few of these by accident and saying, well, he just, in a sense, got lucky and actually was able to fulfill some of those just by chance, doesn't make a great deal of sense, because Peter Stoner, in his book, Science Speaks, just goes back and looks at 8 of these messianic prophecies, the one in Zechariah and a couple of others, and asks, what is the reasonable probability that an individual by chance could actually fulfill just 8 of those messianic prophecies? And he comes up with a number of 1 chance in 10 to the 17th power. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of the miracles, because Jesus not only appealed to the fact that he fulfilled prophecy, but also that he performed miracles before those individuals. But as we wind down this particular section, let me just encourage you again to visit our website. It is www.pointofview.net. Click on that donate button so that you can make a year-end gift and help us out financially. And, of course, if you would like to talk to someone, of course, the number is 800-347-5151 for your pledge. And, of course, if you'd like to write to us, the address is Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. We do need to hear from you, and if you can help us out financially, these kinds of programs certainly will continue. So we want to partner with you, and we want to encourage you to give to this ministry so that we can continue to proclaim the name of Jesus, which is exactly what we're doing here today. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we are talking about the deity of Jesus Christ. A lot of this comes from a book called Jesus, which is written by Tim LaHaye, and the 4th chapter there is entitled Miracles, Who Else Can Do These Things? And so I thought for just a minute, as we talk about some of the arguments we would make to our friends, co-workers, and just even individuals you might meet in some kind of evangelistic opportunity, to talk about miracles. And one of the things I've noticed is that most Christians say, well, I'm not going to talk about miracles because, after all, a person who's not a Christian, a person who does not believe that Jesus is the Son of God, a person that does not believe the Bible is going to accept these miracles. And my response to that, and I think Tim LaHaye does a good job of that, is saying, well, first of all, when Jesus walked on this earth, one of the things he said testified to the fact that he was sent by the Father were those miracles. So the first issue I was going to point out is that that's what he used to actually verify his testimony. And more importantly, the fact is that even the skeptics had to acknowledge something. They said, well, he must have power from Satan or something. I mean, because they recognized that something had happened that they could not explain. Here is an individual that in their village had been born blind and is now able to see. Here is an individual that was never able to walk, who was lame, who's now walking. And so, if nothing else, I think talking about miracles, even if some people might disagree with it, is certainly something which is validated in the Bible. And I think is, again, just another one of those important arguments for the deity of Jesus Christ. Now, you can really divide the miracles down to kind of 5 categories. So I'll give you a sample of each. And that is, first of all, the power to manipulate natural laws. Number 2, the power to replicate items. Number 3, the power to cast demons out of people. Number 4, the power to heal all manner of diseases. And number 5, the power to raise the dead. And again, we see that especially in the Gospel of John, a real strong focus on this idea of miracles. In John 3:2, for example, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And in John 5:36, for the very works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. So others said that about him. He said that about himself. Well, let's look at the first miracle. Of course, that's the miracle of manipulating matter, and that took place at the wedding in Cana. We read about that in John chapter 2, 7, verses 7 to 11, changing water into wine. And so that is one of the miracles we run into. The next type of miracles is the power over nature. Now, we see this in a number of cases, but let's just talk about one where there is this incredible storm there in the Sea of Galilee. And in Matthew 8, it says that Jesus rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm. Just again, the surprise on the part of the disciples that he had such control over the forces of nature. And then on 2 different occasions, we see that Jesus was able to multiply things, that is, feed a multitude of individuals supernaturally. Matthew 14, with feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000, done in 2 different venues to 2 different audiences. And again, something which those around are astonished because they recognize that there is not enough food, as he even asked Andrew in the next town to feed these people, and that is able to feed them all at that particular point. Of course, we have the casting out of demons, which are fallen angels. We see that first encounter in Capernaum in Mark chapter 1, verse 23, but you have other cases where that takes place as well. And then, of course, we have the healing touch of Jesus. For example, he would touch a leper in Mark 1. In one case, in Matthew 8, he just merely speaks a word, and the miracle takes place, as he did for the centurion's servant. So again, we have all sorts of categories of individuals that were healed. Now, on at least 4 occasions, we have a place where the Messiah had the power to restore sight. And it's interesting because some looking back at Isaiah, where it talks about him providing sight, the assumption was always made that this only applied to spiritual insight. But again, whether it's in Matthew 9, the 2 blind men, a blind man in Bethsaida, in Mark 8, you have some examples again of curing blindness at that time. And perhaps the most dramatic miracles, if you will, are the places where Jesus actually raised someone from the dead. You have the raising of the dead man in Luke 7. You have the daughter of Jairus in Matthew 9. And, of course, perhaps the most famous is the raising of Lazarus in John 11. So a couple of very significant examples of raising the dead, which, of course, we'll get to in just a minute when we talk about him coming from the dead as well because of the resurrection. But I thought I would also go to one other chapter which is in the book, because this, I think, can be a very effective witnessing tool when you spend some time talking with Orthodox Jews. It's chapter 5, and it's called The Greatest Prophet. I've mentioned this before on the program, but let me come back to it again, because without a doubt, one of the most preeminent heroes of the Jewish faith is Moses, of course. And there's a prophecy about Moses and the future Messiah. It says in Deuteronomy 18 that the coming Messiah would be a prophet like Moses. As a matter of fact, the Talmud refers to the Messiah will be the greatest of future prophets and have a spirit like Moses. And so one of the things that's very interesting is Timothy on 12 different places talks about the uncanny parallels between Moses and Jesus. Let me mention them real quickly because they are significant. Both men, for example, spent their infant years in Egypt. Both men grew to become tremendous leaders, teachers, and prophets. Both men fasted for 40 days. Both men delivered the law from a mountain. In Moses' case, it was Mount Sinai. In Jesus' case, it was, of course, the Sermon on the Mount, or you could maybe even look at the Mount of Transfiguration. Number 5, both men performed remarkable miracles before eyewitnesses. Both men had power over demonic forces. Both men, interesting enough, had power over bodies of water. You can see Moses parting the Red Sea, Jesus, as I just mentioned a minute ago, calming the Sea of Galilee, walking on the water. Both men's faces shone with the glory of heaven. There you certainly see Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, and his face radiates. And, of course, in the Mount of Transfiguration, of course, Jesus radiates. Number 9, Moses lifted up a brazen serpent to actually heal the people. And Jesus was lifted up on a cross to heal believers from sin. That's a parallel you also find in the book of Hebrews. Interesting enough, on the 17th day of Nisan, which is a month in the Jewish calendar, Moses and Jesus both offered salvation to the people, and that happened 1,500 years apart. Number 11, both men died on a hill, and number 12, their bodies did not remain in a tomb. And so, if nothing else, we see that Jesus is seen as a prophet. And you can think of all sorts of prophetic things that Jesus did. He predicts that the centurion's servant will be healed in Matthew 8. He predicts that Lazarus will be raised from the dead in John 11. He predicts the disciples will find a room prepared for the Passover. He predicts that Judas will betray him. He predicts that his disciples will flee following his arrest. He predicts that Peter will deny him 3 times. We see that in Matthew 26. He predicts his crucifixion. He predicts that he will see his disciples after his resurrection. We see that in Mark 14. He predicts that the Holy Spirit will fill his disciples. We see that in John 14. And he predicts that Jerusalem's temple will be destroyed, and that is in Matthew 24. So if nothing else, you again have some really interesting parallels. And if nothing else, I hope that you recognize that in some ways I'm giving you some kind of new tools to put in your evangelism toolbox, new tools to put into your apologetics toolbox. So even as you talk about Jesus and call people to believe in Jesus, at the same time, you will also find some other ways maybe to get their attention. And so this is one of the reasons why we wanted to cover some of this today here on Point of View. Well, let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the resurrection, because certainly that is the capstone and the foundation of everything that we believe in terms of Jesus. We'll talk about the evidence, some of the attempted theories to explain it away. But before we do, let me again mention that one of the things I encourage you to do is go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, I hope that you will also click on the button that says donate. And if you can help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. As we come to year end, this is certainly a time in which we wanted to hear from you. At the same time, I know some of you might want to just simply write out a check and make it out to Point of View and send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. And if you'd like to make a pledge and talk to someone, that is certainly available as well, 1-800-347-5151. Let's take a break, though. We've been talking about the deity of Jesus Christ. It would be remiss if we didn't spend some time, as we will next, talking about the resurrection of Jesus and how important that is to our faith as well. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we've been talking about the deity of Jesus Christ, taking some things from this book called Jesus by Tim LaHaye. And Chapter 6 is entitled, Everyone Knows He Rose. So I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the resurrection, because this is, of course, the foundation stone of our biblical faith. So when we talk about the resurrection, let's recognize that the resurrection of Jesus is mentioned more than 100 times in the New Testament. It's sort of the foundation for the Christian faith. As many of us have said before, it's really the only logical explanation for how you have a bunch of depressed, despondent, even fearful disciples who turn out to be a faction of bold, determined leaders who go out and die a martyr's death. As a matter of fact, we have had Sean McDowell on this program, and his most recent academic book actually documents the martyrdom of these various apostles, and is very well done, by the way, and also is included in the More Evidence That Demands a Verdict addition, because there is just so much evidence to suggest that none of them recanted. None of them said, well, wait a minute, and maybe this was a conspiracy that we put together. And yet that, of course, has been the way in modern times people have tried to come up with that, whether it's the Passover plot or the Jesus papers. There have been all sorts of books that have been published to try to explain away the resurrection. Well, let's look at the facts for just a minute. Jesus was whipped, he was beaten, he was crowned with thorns, he was crucified and speared. He was certified as dead by a Roman centurion. We read about that in Mark 15. We have the testimony of blood and water coming out of Jesus' pierced side in John 19, and we know now that that is a good evidence of massive clotting of blood in the arteries, medical proof of death. And so we have this dead individual on the cross. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, you know how brutal the execution of Jesus was. So now you have to come up with some kind of explanation, because then he is taken down from the cross. He is put into the tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. You have Roman guards sealing the tomb, standing guard, and yet everyone acknowledges the tomb is empty. And then you also have the appearance of Jesus to so many people after the resurrection. Let me just give you a short rundown of those. There are quite a few. Mary Magdalene in Mark 16 and John 20 meets a group of women in Matthew 18 and Luke 24, appears to the apostle Peter, Luke 24, appears to the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Mark 16, appears to 10 disciples in Luke 24 and John 20, then to all 11 disciples later. Remember when Thomas was not there, you have that in John 20. Appears to disciples on the Sea of Galilee in the north in John 21. He appears to more than 500 people in Galilee in Matthew 28. He appears to James in 1 Corinthians 15. He appears to the apostles on the Mount of Olives in Luke 24 and Acts 1. So you have to come up with some kind of explanation for an empty tomb. Well, one of the explanations we have actually in Scripture, and it's in Matthew 28. And that was the theory that was put forward by the Jewish leaders that the disciples stole the body. Now, first of all, does that make any sense? We just pointed out all these disciples were scattered and fearful and all the rest, and now they become bold and proclaim this conspiracy. Not one of them recants. Augustine said, if the guards were awake, why should they suffer the body to be taken away? If asleep, how could they know that the disciples took it? It doesn't work very well. They ran away. They all died a brutal death, with exception of John. Now, some evidence maybe he died or was executed in the Isle of Patmos. We don't know, but nevertheless, they are preaching the gospel, preaching the fact that Jesus rose from the dead in the very city where Jesus was crucified, and it just doesn't make a great deal of sense. Now, at the turn of the last century, there was what was known as the swoon theory. I don't know how people can hold to that if they've even watched the movie, The Passion of the Christ, but the idea was, well, Jesus, he didn't really die. He just swooned on the cross and then later appeared to his disciples of the Lord of life. But again, think about this. He was severely beaten. 4 executioners witnessed his death. He's embalmed in all these spices. How could he roll away a tomb? Some people think it might even be a 2-ton stone in front of the entrance. How could he overpower the guards? How could he walk several miles to Emmaus? It just really is very difficult to come up with an explanation that Jesus swooned on the cross. There are individuals that have researched this that say that we have no evidence of anybody ever surviving crucifixion. Some say, well, the women went to the wrong tomb. Well, then what? The men went to the wrong tomb? The Romans went to the wrong tomb? Joseph of Arimathea didn't know which tomb he was in? That doesn't make a great deal of sense. And some have said, well, maybe they just wanted him to be alive, so they hallucinated this. The problem with that is hallucinations are individual. 500 people saw Jesus. At least in one case, you have a real hardened skeptic, Thomas. He says, until I see his wounds, I'm not going to believe this. And I love the fact that indeed he was not willing to simply capitulate to some of the rumors that people had made. And so I think we see in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul saying that if the dead do not rise, then Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. But the good news is that he is raised from the dead. Romans 10, verse 9, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And when you really look at the claims that Jesus makes, either he's an incredible liar, and I find very few people want to land on that one, or maybe you say, well, he's a lunatic, and that is, he just was mentally unbalanced, and that certainly does not fit very well. Or otherwise, maybe it's a legend. Maybe some of these documents were written so long after the past that these stories began to develop. You have the Jesus of history, but you have the Christ of faith. Well, we've talked about this in previous programs, how the New Testament documents are written at the time in which the skeptics could disagree. Nobody disagreed with the fact that the tomb was empty. And so if you get rid of all the other L's, Lord, liar, legend, lunatic, you only got one left, right? Lord, because anything else doesn't make a great deal of sense. Well, that's just a quick overview of a lot of material that is in many books on the subject of apologetics. And, of course, I've taken a fair amount of the outline today from this excellent book by Tim LaHaye called Jesus. But, again, you can find material on our website that will certainly be helpful to you. And one of the most important arguments, I think, for the fact that Jesus is alive is how Jesus changes lives. Your testimony is a very good, powerful testimony, and the testimony of literally millions, if not billions of people is perhaps also one of the best evidences for the fact that Jesus is still alive. Let me, just before we wind down this hour, encourage you to visit our website. It is www.pointofview.net. And as you click on the donate button, you can make a special gift just before year end. And we obviously are very dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you, as well as every program. So again, your support would help us end the year in the black. So as you make your gift, again, you might ask for some of the resources we've talked about even today, like Messianic prophecy booklets and others. And so feel free to check all that out or go to our store and see what's available. But in addition to that, we certainly want to hear from you. So if you can go to the website, pointofview.net, that would be great. If you'd like to talk to someone, maybe make a pledge or put it on your credit card and talk to someone, again, that number is 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. But most importantly, you can also just make a check out to Point of View, make it as generous as you possibly can, and send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. That's all we have, and so let me again thank you for listening to Point of View.